The things people do for love, incredible gestures, extravagant gifts, and sometimes something much bigger. A 10-year war, scorched earth, an empty city. Grief for the losers, glory for the victors. That's exactly what Homer described in the Iliad. But what if none of it happened the way we think? What if the most beautiful love story in history is, in fact, an incredibly beautiful lie? Something closer to Romeo and Juliet than to a historical record. Let's take it in order. A couple of weeks ago, Christopher Nolan's new film hit theaters, The Odyssey. Matt Damon, Zendaya, Anne Hathaway, a $250 million budget, the most beautiful woman on Earth, 1,000 ships sent to bring her home. There's just one problem. Just last year, while Nolan was still editing this film, archaeologists at the real site of Troy in Turkey dug something up. Arrowheads, sling stones, the charred remains of buildings, and bodies buried in a hurry with no ceremony at all, right at the palace walls. The war was real. That's barely up for debate anymore. But the reason it started? That's a different story. There's good reason to believe the myth of Helen the Beautiful is a gorgeous piece of packaging for something far less romantic, and that for 3,000 years, the legend of what people go to war for, over love, has simply been a lie. Let's start simple. Did the city of Troy even exist? For a long time, the answer was no. Troy was considered pure literature, a beautiful invention of Homer's, roughly on the same shelf as Middle-earth or Narnia. Up until the 19th century, serious historians simply didn't treat it as a real place. Everything changed in the 1870s, when a German amateur entrepreneur named Heinrich Schliemann, a man with no formal archaeological training, who'd made his fortune in trade, took Homer's text almost literally as a map and went looking for the place described in the Iliad. He found a hill called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, and he started digging. What turned up there stunned the scholarly world. Not one city, but literally a layer cake of cities, one built on top of the ruins of another, again and again, across almost 4,000 years. Archaeologists counted at least 9 major layers, from the Bronze Age all the way to the Roman period.
The problem was that Schliemann, in his rush to find his gold, literally cut a trench straight through several important layers with bulldozer-level subtlety, destroying evidence that would be priceless today. For years, that gave skeptics plenty of reason to doubt the whole project. But excavation continued all through the 20th century, and it's still going on today. Gradually, scholarly focus narrowed to 2 specific layers, Troy 6 and Troy 7a. Troy 6 was a wealthy, fortified Bronze Age city with powerful walls, expensive pottery, horses kept inside the citadel. Interestingly, Homer repeatedly calls the Trojans tamers of horses, which lines up unexpectedly well with the findings. This city was destroyed around 1300 BC, but as far as we can tell, by an earthquake, not a war. What was built on top of it, Troy 7a, tells a very different story. Signs of violent destruction by fire, arrowheads embedded directly in the walls, skeletons left unburied, and, tellingly, large stores of grain jars buried in the ground. As if the people there were bracing for a long siege, not going about ordinary life. And here's the key detail added by last season's excavation. Right by the palace, archaeologists found a cluster of sling stones and arrowheads dated to roughly 3,200 to 3,600 years ago, exactly the period Greek tradition assigns to the Trojan War. And there's a subtle detail archaeologists point to here. People who win a siege usually gather up their sling ammunition and take it with them. People who lose just leave everything where it fell. Here, the ammunition was left lying on the ground. This doesn't prove Achilles existed. It doesn't prove there was a wooden horse or the move that legends would later be built around. What it does say is that roughly in the right place at roughly the right time, something that looks very much like a large-scale war actually happened. Okay, say the city was real. Say the war was real too. So where does Helen come from? This is where it gets interesting. Homer wrote the Iliad around the 8th century BC, roughly 400 years after the events it describes supposedly took place. He wasn't a journalist reporting from the scene. He was a poet working with an oral tradition
passed down generation after generation by singers and storytellers. Over 400 years, stories tend to change. They pick up details. They get simplified into whatever's easiest to remember and easiest to sing around a fire. And what's easier for human memory and emotion than a story about love, jealousy, and a beautiful woman? But we have something Homer didn't: independent written records from another civilization. The Hittite Empire, neighbors and contemporaries of these events, kept diplomatic correspondence and archives. And in those archives, the ones excavated and deciphered long before any Hollywood premiere, a city called Wilusa comes up repeatedly, a name that's strikingly close, linguistically, to the Greek Ilion, Troy's other name. And in those same archives, Hittite kings mention tension, conflict, even direct military clashes in this region, right around the time the Trojan War is supposed to have happened. So what were these kings actually arguing about? Not a woman. What we're looking at isn't a beautiful love story, it's plain geopolitics. Troy sat in one of the most important geographic spots in the ancient world, right at the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, which connects the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. That narrow bottleneck was the gateway for trade. Grain, metal, timber, everything moving between mainland Greece, Anatolia, and the lands around the Black Sea physically had to pass through those waters. Whoever controlled Troy controlled the tolls, controlled access, controlled an entire trade artery of the Bronze Age. In other words, this was a war for control of one of the most important trade choke points in the ancient world: resources, tolls, logistics, exactly what people have always gone to war over, before Troy and after it. It's just that version doesn't make for a very good story to tell your grandchildren or sing around a campfire with your fellow soldiers. And here's what's genuinely interesting. This isn't a one-off case of a beautiful story replacing a much less beautiful, but perfectly ordinary, one. We see this exact pattern again and again: a conflict over resources, power, control of trade routes, which, over years, decades, or centuries, gets turned into a much simpler, more emotional story. Because it's easier for people, 3,000 years ago just as much as today, to remember and retell a story about love, honor, or betrayal than one about logistics and tolls. Troy was real. The war, most likely, was real too. But the reason we've celebrated for almost 3,000 years? Probably a lie. Or, well, maybe just the longest-running PR job in human history. So next time you walk out of a theater moved by a beautiful love story that supposedly cost a country everything, remember this: maybe it's worth asking the same question we ask every time here. What was actually behind it? Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm really putting a lot of effort into making these stories interesting and entertaining for you. Please subscribe. There are many more exciting stories to come. Thank you so much. You're the best.